Welcome to Raising Daughters, the podcast that helps parents learn the best ways to support their daughters as they navigate the high levels of stress, anxiety, pressure, and uncertainty so pervasive in our culture today. Dr. Tim Jordan is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician who has specialized in counseling girls for over 30 years and sheds light on the realities of today's young women in all facets of their lives. This is your opportunity to learn how to better support your daughters, making them feel safe, secure, and truly loved in the midst of life's ups and downs. Here is your host, Dr. Tim.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to Raising Daughters. Today, I have a more sobering, deep conversation I want to have with you about the concept of grief. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about this, it's because I see lots of girls in my counseling practice and also sometimes my retreats, this whole issue of loss and how we as a culture, how we as families, how we deal with that issue. And I think a lot of times we don't do a very good job of it. I saw a girl recently who her parents wanted her to come see me. She was a junior in high school, and she had been sad recently. And a lot of it was about the fact that she had lost two friends to a car accident, two high school friends, a year previous. And she had gone through some grieving, but she still was grieving. She was still sad. And the anniversary of their death had come up, and that had kind of triggered another outpouring of grief from her. And she was really upset because none of her friends were still sad, and most of them looked at her like she was crazy, like it's been a year, move on. And her parents thought, she's too depressed, she needs to go see somebody, so that's why I got to see her. And I think what this young lady needed was this to be heard. I think what she needed was for her emotions to be normalized, for her grief to be normalized, and for someone to tell her it's okay to still be grieving. It's okay to do it in your way and in your time. And I think too often we don't give kids that kind of permission. I think the whole culture does a bad job with grieving. We do a bad job with all of the quote unquote dark emotions. I did a podcast over this past year, interviewed the author of a book called Night Vision. And I will put that link in my show notes so you can go back and review that. I talked about all the emotions, especially things like anger and sadness and anxiety, depression. Didn't spend too much time on grief. So I thought I would talk about this since I see it as an issue for lots of kids. And the losses come in different packages, right? Sometimes it's a loss of friends like this girl had. Sometimes it's from a suicide of a friend. Sometimes it's a loss of a friend group because somebody gets ditched. They get left out. Their friends move on. Sometimes it's because a friend actually moves. They move out of the city. So they lost their best friend, if you will, and they're alone for a while. Sometimes it's a loss of a pet. And sometimes we somewhat minimize that loss. But for a lot of girls, their pets are really important to them. For some girls, that's a person who they go and talk to. That's the one who always is there to listen. So the loss of a pet is a big thing for lots of kids. It could be the loss of a parent. A loss of a parent meaning a parent may pass away, or maybe the parents get divorced and then the kids, this girl doesn't see one of her parents after the divorce, or they may see a parent sometimes, but not as much. And sometimes that one of those parents will get remarried and then they have other kids, and so they have less time for them. And so there's a sense of, I've lost my mom, I've lost my dad. For some kids, it's just a parent who's neglectful. I see kids sometimes whose parents have addiction issues, alcoholics, or parents who just work all the time and just aren't there. There's a loss of that. For some kids who have been through divorce, it's that loss of the family that they wish for, like their fantasy family, if you will. I also see losses in things like moving on. I've done podcasts about touch points, times in our lives when we're about to go through a big leap in development. Excuse me, like if you're a senior in high school or a senior in college, there's times when we're about to embark on a new leg of our journey. And so that involves going towards your new adventure, the excitement of a new phase of your life, but it also means leaving behind the potential loss of friends, family, the relationships that you had, your nest, your safety zone. All that is kind of, in a sense, a loss for kids, which is why there's a lot of emotional turmoil that comes up prior to big changes like that, big transitions, big leaps in development. So there's lots of ways that kids experience loss. And so I want to talk about a few things. First of all, I think the whole culture needs an adjustment as far as how we view grief. Let me read some of ways that people express when people are sad or grieving, how people kind of describe that. People, the kids, the girls I see themselves may describe this way, or the people around them as well. They'll say, I'm falling apart. Oh, I'm falling to pieces. People say she's losing it. Or sometimes they'll say, I've been breaking down a lot. Or I'm a mess because I've been crying a lot. I'm down in the dumps. I read this expression someplace where people say sometimes My face is like a wet weekend. I thought that was a kind of a funny one. At camp, sometimes when kids are missing their parents, we don't say they're a little bit sad because, they're missing home. They'll say they're homesick. Notice the word sick in there. We pathologize grief a lot of times. We talk about people who agonize, people in anguish. Sometimes we'll see people grieving and we automatically go to, oh, they're depressed. There's despair. They're suffering. They're down in the dumps. They're miserable. We use expressions like they're wailing, or they have the blues, or becoming brokenhearted, or having a heavy heart, or being heart sick. Again, that sick word. We talk about people who are crying, who are blubbering, they're bawling, they're turning on the waterworks, they're sniveling and whimpering, and we want people to keep it together. So I think even just the way we describe a lot of times the sad emotions and the grieving emotions tells us how we view them. A lot of judgment, even the way we talk to people when they've lost someone. If they've lost a friend, or they've lost an aunt or a grandparent, we talk about the person being in a better place. We tell them like everything was for the best. Or if someone loses a child with a miscarriage or something, we'll say, well, you can always have another child. You won't always feel this bad. You're stronger than you think. Everything happens for a reason. And a lot of those expressions that are well-intentioned sends a message that I want you to stop feeling because you're making me uncomfortable. I don't like being around sadness. I don't like being around grief. So those expressions are kind of like, move along because you're stirring up a lot of emotions in me. And I don't like that. I'm uncomfortable. We try and push people too quickly through their grief, as if grief is a problem to be fixed instead of an experience for them to have to pass through. Sometimes kids who are doing normal grieving become classified as being depressed. Grief became classified in the DSM as a mental health disorder. They said, and they even created a new concept called persistent complex bereavement disorder. Again, disorder. And so a lot of times what happens is we pathologize it. I've read this somewhere that one of the fathers of psychiatry, Emil Kraepelin, he decided in 1917 that grief was an illness. It became physicalized, it became pathologized, and then it started to become medicated. And now it's all those things, all those things way amped up, especially the medication thing. We're medicalizing normality. So all those judgments that we have about people who are grieving, even just judgments about people who are sad. I think sometimes we see people who are sad as being, or people who are grieving as being sad. We see people who we describe them as being lazy sometimes, self-indulgent, broken, self-pitying, weak. That's still in the culture, especially for boys, but girls as well. They're having a pity party. They're wallowing in their pity. And we oftentimes shame them for having normal emotions. A lot of those dark moods, as I said, have been classified as mental illnesses. They're classified as diseases, pathology. It's an illness that needs to be treated. It's a problem that needs to be treated as opposed to an experience that needs to be experienced and passed through. In this culture today, it's so easy to stay busy from our emotions. It's really easy to stay distracted from them with our busy schedules, with our devices, with our social media. So people don't oftentimes have the will or the courage or the time to sit down and allow themselves to actually feel things, allow themselves to go through that. I talked about that in previous podcasts. Even when people offer people tools for their emotions, it sort of suggests that something is broken. And we want to cheer people up. We want to do it to make other people less uncomfortable. Not only does it make people feel ashamed of having those emotions, it also makes them feel misunderstood and more alone. They feel bad about feeling bad. They feel like they're disappointing people around them. There's a sense of if you loved your family, if you loved your friends, you would hide those dark emotions so you don't make them sad. In that podcast I did this past year about the book Night Vision, I talked about how having emotions like sadness and grief, it's a way for people to connect in a sense, because most of us have experienced losses. So it's a chance for people to say, I know that feeling. I know you. I understand. People talk about how misery loves company. That's because misery, sadness, grief wants company. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to be understood. We want someone to hug us and put their arms around us and say, I know this feeling. It's okay. I get you. It's okay. I'm here to listen. I mentioned one time before in one of these podcasts, I think, I give a lot of talks and things, so sometimes I forget when I said what, but there's a really sweet children's book called Rabbit Listened. And it's about this little boy who gets upset because these birds come by and knock down this beautiful tower of blocks and Legos he had taken so much time to build. And so people keep coming by. He's sitting in his room, looking like, for those of you who are on YouTube, like with this frown on his face. So people come by to try and cheer him up. He doesn't want to be cheered up. His parents come by. Different animals come by and offer different kinds of things. Like a hyena wants him to laugh it out. laugh about it. So anyway, but none of those things help. And he's still angry. And then a rabbit comes into the room and sits down next to him and doesn't say a word, just sits there and allows him to be and allows him to feel and to be exactly where he is. And then the boy does open up. He does start to talk about it, but only because the rabbit created that space for him. We all can do that because, number one, we can all could be empathetic listeners, but also we all know how that feels. Those expressions of sadness and grief are meant to trigger compassion and connection within us. We're wired for connection. We're wired for a sense of belonging. We're wired to be with people. It's one of the things that I think is so valuable about my weekend retreats and summer camps, Camp Welokai for girls, is that we have circle time in the weekend retreats and the summer camps where the girls who are all in the same age, either grade school, middle school, or high school, they get a chance to talk about their lives, talk about their experiences. And sometimes something like loss comes up. And then people get to hear about all the different losses that other people have experienced. All the ones I mentioned above, about parents, about friends, about death, about the loss of their childhood, about moving on, not wanting to grow up. There's all kinds of losses. And having the ability to sit in a safe circle with your peers and to share your grief or share your feelings and share your experiences, and you're not judged and nobody tries to fix you. They just listen. And then they also end up sharing their own stories often. They say, I get you. I see you. I understand. I've been through something similar. And then they share their story. And what girls will say after having a week or a weekend of those kinds of sharing experiences is, I used to think I was crazy. I always thought I was the only one. And now I know I'm not alone. Other people really can understand. Other people can see me, understand me. And that's a very deep level of connection. At our retreats and summer camps, we also connect through high intensity fun, lots of ways. But that deep sharing in those circle times is one way of connecting. So all of your kids need to have an experience like that, either with their mom, their dad, uncle, a counselor like me, in a camp experience like ours, instead of being pathologized and labeled and medicated. I know there's an old story that I use sometimes in my retreats and camps. It's about a little girl who's upset. And so she goes to her grandfather and she tells him about having all these negative, angry, sad thoughts in her head. And the grandfather says, I know just what you're talking about. He said, I have the same thing going on in my head. And he said, it's like I have two wolves in my head. And one wolf is very angry and very pessimistic and very upset and says negative, critical things to me. But there's this other wolf in my head who's very optimistic and very positive and very encouraging and very loving and nurturing. And he said those two wolves are always fighting to see which one's going to win out. And his granddaughter said, well, grandfather, which one of the wolves wins? And the grandfather said, the wolf that wins is the one that I feed the most. Now, I don't want that to mean that you only feed positive feelings, because sometimes I think kids in our culture have gotten the message that you should always have positive feelings. You should always be cheerful. You should never be angry. You should never be sad. You should never be anxious. When in reality, being fully human means you feel all those things. And being fully human doesn't mean you're supposed to be feeling happy. It's about being able to feel everything in its time. So the wolf story doesn't mean don't feed or don't think about or don't process through or express those emotions. It just means don't dwell on them only and forget about the other stuff. Because I want kids to be able to express and to be in those emotions. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So first and foremost, we need to do a better job of understanding those emotions. We need to stop labeling and pathologizing and medicating at the first sign of any kind of grief or sadness. And we need to allow girls to know that it's normal and healthy for them to grieve at their own pace, in their own way, and in their own time. So that girl who's in high school who I saw, I told her it's okay for you to still be grieving. She's doing fine in life. She's not sad all the time. Sometimes things get triggered. Some things at school, or she'll hear about a car accident, or she'll think about her friends, and it's okay. I usually tell kids that for the rest of your life, there's going to be a soft place in your heart about that experience. It's like your life is a tapestry. That's one of the little squares in your tapestry. And sometimes it'll be triggered and sad feelings may come up, and that's okay. That's being fully alive. So I try and normalize it for kids. It's okay to do it in their own way and in their own time. I saw a girl in my counseling practice several months ago who had her first real boyfriend. This girl is now a junior in high school. And they dated for 6 months, and then he kind of ghosted her. And then within a couple of days, he was dating one of her best friends. So of course she felt sad and angry and disappointed, and she was confused, and she had a whole myriad of emotions, which is of course normal. But now I saw her, it's been 6 months, and people are upset with her because she hasn't moved on. She should be over him. And the truth is, unfortunately, that she has to see her ex every day at school and her ex best friend for that matter. And so then she'll see them at things like she saw him at prom. Things got triggered again. She bumps into him because he doesn't live too far from her house. Every day at school, he'll see them walking down the hallway holding hands. Well, of course, she's going to be triggered. That makes it a lot harder to grieve and to be able to process through and move on because it's still right in her face. It would have been a lot easier if he went to a different school or something. But I want her to know that's okay for her to still be grieving that loss. She never got closure. She's going to have to create closure within herself because he will probably never do that for her, but only when she's ready. I let her know that when you're ready, I can help you through that process of, excuse me, not only just letting it go, but maybe a process of forgiveness. She's not ready for it, and that's okay. But at some point, she'll probably want to let that go because otherwise, she will keep being triggered. And in a sense, she's giving him the power to change her moods. I had a different girl who grew up in a home where her mom was an alcoholic. And starting at about the age of 4, her mom became pretty neglectful because she was drunk a lot at home. When she was around her daughter, she was very critical and snapped at her a lot and took out her anger on her daughter. So this girl became very close to her dad, who did a great job, by the way, of being there for her. But she experienced her mom's behavior as a loss. She lost her mom, or the mom she wanted her to be. When she would go to friends' houses and see them with their moms, it always made her sad because that's what she wanted and she didn't have it. Her mom has been sober now for about 2 years, and for about a year. And her mom wants her to just forgive and forget and move on. And this girl is not quite ready to let go of all those emotions. She's still feeling the loss of what once was or could have been with her mom. She's also still angry, but I think the sadness and the loss is even bigger. That's like the root feeling, if you will. And I told her it's still okay for her to not be ready to forgive. She says her mom has never apologized. That kind of sticks in her craw, if you will. Her mom may never apologize. Her mom may never be willing to face that because of probably her shame, etc. She has not been through a 12-step program, which may have helped her through. That's one of the steps. But even so, I let this girl know it's okay for her not to be ready. Again, I can help her through that process of learning about forgiveness and all that. But when she's ready, so it's okay for her to have whatever feelings she wants. There's a cost to her of hanging on to anger because she gets triggered a lot. There's a cost, but she's willing right now to experience the cost. So I told her when you're ready to not be triggered so much and all that, and I can kind of shepherd you through that process. It also means that our kids need healthy ways to express their emotions. I talked about this prior to the need for our girls and boys, for that matter, to have regular, quiet, alone time where they can process through their thoughts, process through their emotions, express their emotions in healthy ways. That can look like having a good cry. It can look like talking to someone like their mom or their dad or their best friend, coming to someone like me and talk about stuff if they need a safe place outside the home. They also need sometimes the stuffed animals that they talk to. Sometimes they talk to their pets, which is why the loss of a pet for some girls is devastating. They need to get that quiet alone time so they can go inward and to know what they're feeling. I've talked before about how many times, girls' emotions stack up, fill up to the point of overload because they don't express them. They stuff them. They get busy from them. They get distracted from them. And so that emotional overload and overwhelm is when things start to leak out. Sometimes it leaks out as depression. So they need to be able to go inward and to know what they're feeling and to express it in healthy ways. I encourage girls to write in their journals, write down their emotions, write down anything that they're feeling. And it should be a private journal so they can write anything. And it may be hate words and maybe curse words. I want them to just blow it out, just let it all hang out, to get it out, to not judge it, just like this is stuff that just needs to come out. I've talked to them about the value of writing letters to people they're upset with. If they're missing someone, write them a letter. I have girls sometimes in my office, I have them close their eyes. I do a visualization with them where I have them imagine someone they lost who comes to them. I have them imagine that they're sitting like in the middle of a clearing in the forest, like sitting on a big stone, and then their grandfather or their aunt or their best friend who they lost will come and sit by them, and they have a conversation in their mind. And they tell them what's going on in their lives. They tell them how much they miss them. Sometimes I have them ask that person for a piece of advice. And that's so touching for kids. They go there and they feel it. And it feels good for them to know that that person is not here in person in my life, but they're still in my heart. They can be in my memories. I can bring them forward and I can be with them for a little while. So there's lots of ways for kids to express emotions journal, letters, stories, write songs, write poetry. The written word is a healthy way to express emotions, as is using art. I'm going to see if I can get some of the art pieces that girls have done for me that are hanging in my office. Try and get a good enough picture to put on this podcast. I have, now probably about 20 pieces of art on the wall, and they're all different. Them expressing their emotions at home. Some of them are abstract. It's just amazing. I'll take a picture of all of them. And hopefully it'll show up on the podcast. So drawing, painting, sculpting, dance, playing an instrument, lots of avenues, lots of ways to experience, be with, release. Also, obviously, talking with a safe listener. I mentioned it before. I think parents can be that person. I hope they are. I would love for your daughters to feel comfortable and safe enough to talk to you about their emotions, but talk about their grief. It means you have to be a good listener, learn to mirror, listen for a while, then say, what I heard you say is blah, 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 blah. Is that right? Okay, tell me more. I don't understand. Tell me more about that. That's so valuable for kids to know that my parent is trying to get in my shoes, walk around in my shoes, see things from my point of view without judgment and without going right to advice. So many girls I talk to talk about how their parents interrupt. They go quickly to fix-it mode, especially dads, but moms too. A lot of girls complain their moms go to this place of, well, what about me? You think you've had such a hard day, and then they make it about them. And the girls, that's so hurtful. I'm opening up to you. I'm being vulnerable. I want you to be there for me, and now you want me to be there for you. Ugh, that's a really unhealthy way for people to be there. So learning how to just listen, be a good mirror, not to overreact, not to judge, not to fix, to just be there. That's like the rabbit who listened. Be good for us to always also to normalize their emotions. Have them becoming aware of the cost to them when they stuff their emotions. I talked about those before in previous podcasts. Headaches, stomach aches, getting sick a lot, anger, being angry at yourself, having problems falling asleep or staying asleep, depression, anxiety, being distracted. There's so many costs to holding on to things. Also, for a lot of kids, they feel ashamed about how they feel. And so that shame just builds. And that's really devastating to hold on to shame when it's really normal and should be normalized for them. I also talked about those safe spaces like my camp. They need safe spaces somewhere. For some kids, it's when they go to grandma and grandpa's house. They may have a grandparent they feel close to, or an aunt or an uncle. That could be a church group, or it could be a camp like Camp Wheeler Guy for Girls, where they have a safe place to let it go. I run a group for high school girls every semester. We usually have 8 or 10 girls, and they love the group. They like to sit in a circle of their peers on the ground in my little meditation chairs. And every 2 weeks, they have a safe space to let it all hang out, to talk, to share. Sometimes it's angry, sometimes it's sad. They're looking for feedback from their peers. They're looking for feedback from me. But having those kinds of safe spaces is really valuable for kids. I think most of us as adults can look back into our childhoods and remember somebody who was there for us, somebody we would go to. And oftentimes it's not a parent, but somebody we could go to, and they would just be there for us. They would mentor us. They would take us under their wing. So valuable, so good for kids to have people outside the home. It's good for them to have people like you inside their home, but also sometimes it's good for them to have people who aren't in the home. Now, sometimes some kids may need some more help than just their mom or dad listening to them. I think if you see your daughter isolating herself, if you see her with a lot of changes, she's not talking to her friends, she's lost interest in her normal interests and passions. If you see her not wanting to go to school, if she's doesn't feel safe talking to you, and you notice that she not only does she look a little depressed, but it's been lasting for weeks. She hides in her room. You see signs like that. That's different than normal grief. At some point, then she might need to talk to someone like me, a counselor. And again, it's not necessarily, it's not a verdict about how good or bad a parent you are. Kids want to talk to someone outside of mom and dad. It just means sometimes they just need someone different, an outsider's point of view. So please provide that for them in some way, shape, or form. So we need to normalize emotions. We need to stop being afraid of grief. We need to let kids know that those are normal feelings. There's no timeline. It isn't like it's been a month. You should be over it. Stop using those expressions like she's losing it and all of that I mentioned earlier in the podcast. Stop talking like that. Stop going right to fix mode and say things like it's all going to be fine. It'll pass. They're in a better place. Blah, 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 blah. Those are things that keep girls stuck in their emotions. Also adds a level of shame. I'm disappointing people. Maybe I shouldn't feel this way. I don't want girls feeling that. I want them to know that grief is a normal process, that those emotions are normal emotions. They do need to be heard. They need to be understood. They need an outlet. And then they need some time. And it does get easier. But I wouldn't just throw that at them right away. It does get easier when you've broken up with your boyfriend or I tell kids all the time that there's something called self-compassion, which I've talked about previously. Self-compassion is when you're having a hard time, coming to terms with something. So you imagine in your mind if your mom or your dad or your therapist or your best friend was in your head, what would they say to you in this moment? Would they shame you? Would they judge you for feeling what you're feeling? Or would they be understanding and nurturing? I would imagine what they would say, and then I would say that to yourself. That's one big part of self-compassion. Another part of self-compassion is reminding yourself or remembering that everybody in the world probably has gone through a breakup. Your mom, your dad, most people have gone through a breakup. And so it is tough. It is horrible. It's a really deep loss. And eventually we do move on. And we find other people, we get married, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a sense of I can connect with this universal experience that losses are tough, losses are hard to get through. It takes a while, but if all those people can eventually process through and move through it, that I can too. So at some point, I think it'd be good for girls to rely on and lean on their self-compassion, but not at the expense of first listening and letting them have their emotions. Let's all do a much better job of supporting our girls and boys through their grief, through all the different losses that they experienced throughout their childhood. I'll have those links I mentioned in my show notes. So you can get those at www.drtimjordan.com. That's my website, www.drtimjordan.com. If you have other ideas for podcasts you'd like from me, other topics for podcasts, then you can email my wife, Anne, A-N-N-E, at drtimjordan.com with comments, feedback, and also requests for future topics. I enjoy doing these. I love doing these. I love the feedback that I get. And I really appreciate that you take the time to, on a walk, driving in the car, however you listen to these podcasts, I appreciate that you take the time to listen in. I will see you all back here in a week.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Raising Daughters. Hopefully you've learned something useful about girls and young women and how to help them navigate the pressures, challenges, and opportunities of modern life. If you want to become a more effective parent, keep listening to the show at drtimjordan.com and let the conversations shape you. Build that one-of-a-kind connection with your daughters in the most profound and meaningful ways possible, shaping them into strong, confident women of the future. That's all for now. See you next week for another episode of Raising Daughters.